Hola, estudiantes! This lesson is called the preterite of IR stem changing verbs. Now you might remember that the verbs that I'm going to cover in this video in the present tense are boot verbs. But what we're going to look at today is that they just change in the shoe in the preterite, in the bottom two. So let's take a look. When we have verbs that are IR stem changing verbs, these are verbs that change in both the present and the preterite. But in the preterite, they just change in the bottom two. In the usted, él, ella form, and in the ustedes, ellos, ellas form. So I like to call them shoe verbs because they just change in the bottom two instead of in the whole boot. Let's look at some examples. A verb like preferir, which means to prefer, changes from E to I. So when we're up above the shoe, there won't be any changes. Yo preferí, tú preferiste, nosotros preferimos, vosotros preferisteis. But in the bottom two, in the shoe, is where we're going to see the changes. The E is going to go to an I. Usted, él, ella prefirió. Ustedes, ellos, ellas prefirieron. Another verb that does a similar change is the verb pedir, which means to order or to ask for. Pedir is also an E to I verb, just in the shoe. So the conjugations are yo pedí, tú pediste, nosotros pedimos, vosotros pedisteis. And in the shoe is where we have the changes. Pidió, pidieron. In our third category are verbs like dormir that change from O to U. It's just a U, not a UE. Make sure you take a note. So outside of the shoe, we just have dormí, dormiste, dormimos, y dormisteis. But in the shoe, we're going to change this O to a U. So we have durmió y durmieron. Now these are not the only three verbs that do this, but I just used those three verbs as examples. I also want to talk about the verb reír because reír, which means to laugh, is extra special. Reír has a lot of accents going on. So we're going to see a change as well as some accents. Yo reí, tú reíste. We're about to get to the changes in the shoe. Usted, él, ella rió. Nosotros reímos. Vosotros reísteis. Ustedes, ellos, ellas rieron. Now, we can memorize all these verbs individually, or we can choose to just recognize patterns. So there are some other verbs that change, like preferir changes. For example, divertirse, which means to have fun. By the way, you cannot tener divertido. That's a big pet peeve of mine. There's no way of owning fun or possessing fun. So divertirse makes the same change as preferir. So does mentir. So does sentirse. Mentir means to lie. And sentirse means to feel. So these verbs, just like preferir, changes from E to I. They're also going to change from E to I, just in the shoe. So what would the conjugations of divertirse be? If you know that this E is going to change to an I in the shoe. Me divertí, te divertiste, se divirtió, nos divertimos, os divertisteis, se divirtieron. What would mentir change to? If we know that that E is going to change to an I, but just in the shoe, what would the conjugations be? Yo mentí, tú mentiste, usted ella mintió, nosotros mentimos, vosotros mentisteis, ustedes ellos ellas mintieron. And if you know the sentir is going to work the same way, the E is going to go to I, what will the conjugation be, remembering that the E goes to I in the shoe? Yo me sentí, tú te sentiste, usted ella se sintió, nosotros nos sentimos, vosotros os sentisteis, ustedes ellos ellas se sintieron. Now let me give you some verbs that conjugate like pedir does. Competir, which means to compete. Despedirse, which means to say goodbye. Repetir, which means to repeat. Seguir, which means to follow. Servir, which means to serve. Y vestirse, which means to get dressed. So all of these verbs work like pedir. The E is going to change to an I. But just in the shoe. So for example, how would we conjugate competir? Competí, competiste, compitió, competimos, competisteis, compitieron. How would we conjugate despedirse? Me despedí, te despediste, se despidió, nos despedimos, os despedisteis, se despidieron. I don't think I need to go through all of those verbs for you to recognize the pattern. Once you know the pattern, you just remember that the E is going to change to an I in the shoe. There's one more other verb that I'm going to cover that works like dormir, and it's the verb morir, which means to die. So, can you figure out how we would conjugate morir if morir works like dormir? Yo morí, tú moriste, usted ella murió, nosotros morimos, vosotros moristeis, ustedes ellos ellas murieron. There's one more verb that conjugates like reír, and that's sonreír. Sonreír means to smile. So if you know that sonreír conjugates like reír, can you figure out what to do? Yo sonreí, tú sonreíste, usted ella sonrió, nosotros sonreímos, vosotros sonreísteis, ustedes ellos ellas sonrieron. This one's really easy because you just copy the son in front of the conjugations of the verb reír. Let's look at a couple of examples of how to use these in context. Mi mamá se aburrió y Se durmió durante la película. Can you tell me what that means? My mom got bored and she fell asleep during the movie. So here's my stem changing verb. Dormir O goes to you for the subject mamá. Here's another example. Mis padres prefirieron ver el concurso de belleza. Can you tell me what that sentence means? My parents preferred to see the beauty contest. And here's my E that went to I in preferir for the subject padres. One more. En la liga compitieron los mejores equipos de México. Can you tell me what that sentence means? In the league, the best teams of Mexico competed. So here's the verb competir with the E that went to an I, with your subject being equipos. Okay, clase. That lesson was on the preterite of IR stem changing verbs. Or if you'd like to call them, shoe verbs. Remember that the stem changes E to I and O to U happen in the shoe. Hasta luego.